Hey everyone, Harold Fisher here, anchor and host of the Daily Drum on WHUR. Welcome to another edition of HUR at Home on WHUR.com and all of our social media platforms. Tonight on HUR at Home, we're talking to Jennifer Epps Addison, co-executive director of CPD Action, that is the political arm of the Center for Popular Democracy. On deck, one of the most consequential elections of our time. Jennifer, thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about CPD Action. Kind of give me the cliff notes of what the organization is about.
Yeah, CPD Action is a network of grassroots community organizations in 35 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. You know, our affiliates are on the front lines of fighting for justice, fighting to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, fighting for universal health care, fighting for a real COVID and pandemic relief bill out of our elected officials, fighting to protect our environment, fighting to transform our criminal justice system. And in this election, they built a program in the 7 states that we knew from the get-go would be critical to defeating this authoritarian. And I am so honored to be a part of this network who helped to engage more than 7 million voters in the 7 states that determine this election.
So we're talking about Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota.
You got it. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And, you know, look, I want to add into that the incredible organizers in Texas and in Florida, even and in North Carolina, even though they were not able to flip their states, the fact that they made states that were previously thought unwinnable competitive forced the GOP to really spread out their energy to defend those states with rigor. And that made a huge opening for us to reclaim some of the states, particularly the states in the blue wall.
But I think it's interesting. You said that they, beforehand, they established this this political force. So they focused on these 7 states. How did they know about these? Why not, for example, Ohio?
Mm-hmm.
Why not an Indiana or a Kentucky or an Illinois? Why these specific states?
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer to that lies in what we actually witnessed. And what we saw on election night was not some spontaneous action by voters just deciding, you know what, we're going to go out and vote in record numbers. What we saw was the fruition of more than a decade of grassroots community organizing, and in particular, new community organizing infrastructure that's been built over the last 4 years. So in Wisconsin, for example, Block and Lit, the 2 organizations that had the largest field footprint, those organizations didn't even exist in 2016. When I think about Lucha in Arizona, that plus the indigenous organizing that helped turn that state blue, those programs didn't even exist 4 years ago. And so, a big piece of this was that we followed and listened to what was happening on the ground with community organizations who are doing this work year round, not just for elections. But here's the other piece that our network established really early. We looked at the numbers. We looked at the data. We looked at what it would take to win and to defeat Donald Trump in the Electoral College, right? Because the popular vote was not going to be enough. And what we realized is that within these 7 states, there were enough Black and brown voters who were eligible but not registered that we would not need to change a single white person's mind from 2016. We could have won this election without getting a single white person to change their vote from 2016 to 2020. And so we knew that, listen, we want everybody to get on board. We hoped, right, that more people, certainly more than the 70+ million that voted for Donald Trump, would reject outright authoritarianism and fascism, but we weren't going to hold our breath for it. Instead, we decided to really target and go after and empower the voters that we knew were going to be the most targeted by this administration, but also had the potential to be the biggest difference makers. So that's why we picked those states, because in a state like Wisconsin, there were over 150,000 eligible but unregistered Black and brown voters, and we only needed to change about 26,000 We only needed about 26,000 votes to defeat Donald Trump. In Michigan, there were nearly 200,000 unregistered and eligible Black and brown voters, and we only needed 11,000 votes in order to catch Donald Trump in that state from what he got in 2016. So we had a strategy that we were really clear about, and we didn't allow the Biden administration or the Biden campaign, who was really heavily focused on converting Republican votes, to change our strategy, because we knew ultimately what would be successful. And as we watched the chips fall and we watched all of those votes come in, it really truly is the story of 2020 that the youngest and the Blackest cities in the country delivered the presidency to Joe Biden.
Your organization works not just with Black voters, but also Latinx, brown voters, and here, one of the 7 states is Florida, and
Yeah.
yet the information that we've seen reported, particularly in South Florida, is that those of Cuban descent were not Biden voters, but Trump voters. Can you explain that? Can you talk a little bit about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing people should know is that when people talk about this as a divided electorate and this is a divided election, we should be really clear. The only folks who are really truly divided in this country are white folks, and the majority of them voted for Donald Trump. When it comes to communities of color, Black folks obviously were the most loyal voters in this election. 91% of Black women and over 80% of Black men voted for Joe Biden. But Latinos made up the second highest demographic voting for Joe Biden. More than 2/3 of Latinos voted for Joe Biden, and then Native Americans, and then Asian Americans. And so by and large, people of color as a whole are overwhelmingly supported ridding the country of Donald Trump. But there are nuances here. And I think it's important for people to understand, and we can't dismiss the fact that Donald Trump did make gains in every racial demographic group from his voter participation in 2016, with Black voters, with Latinx voters, with Asian voters, and certainly with white voters and white women. And the question is why, right? What is it that made Black voters, or a small subset of Black voters and a subset of Latinx voters support a racist authoritarian? And at the end of the day, it's a couple of things, right? So intimidation, suppression, and misinformation are certainly huge parts of this story. And we saw all of the underhanded tactics, not just of this administration, but of his Republican lackeys in states, whether it was Brian Kemp in Georgia or DeSantis in Florida. But the other thing that we saw is engagement. Donald Trump, I have to see the numbers. I haven't gotten them back, but what I do know is that Donald Trump's campaign spent an awful lot of money, maybe even more than the Biden campaign, directly engaging and speaking to both Black and Latinx voters. And we cannot discount the fact that the Obama-Biden administration was named the deporter in chief. That's what immigrant rights activists called Obama's White House, right? Called President Obama and his White House the deporter in chief. And Joe Biden, while he made several gains in various pieces of policy, particularly his energy policy, when it came to immigration, it was really too little, too late. There were many people warning about the problem of engaging Latinx folks, especially Latinx men, and the engagement came way too late on the Biden campaign and was a centerpiece of the Trump campaign, particularly in Miami-Dade County. And I think we saw the results of that. While overwhelmingly Miami-Dade Latinx folks voted for Joe Biden, not enough to help carry the state, and Trump got a much more significant share of that vote in 2020 than he did in 2016.
To piggyback on that, on election day in Maryland, just outside of the the DC area, I spoke to a voter. She was a Latinx, and I asked her who she voted for. And she had a heavy accent, and she was also wearing a mask. But she said that she voted for Donald Trump. And I asked her why. And I asked her, did the comments that candidate Trump made, and then President Trump made about the Hispanic communities, immigrants and the like, did it bother her? And she said, of course. But what she did say was that economics were more important to her than racism. And I found that really fascinating. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, what it shows you is how the Democrats have not really built a message that speaks to the core values of the base of the party, right? And I say that to say the vast majority of Democratic voters support moving to a single payer healthcare system. During the primaries, in every single primary in which the question was asked, regardless of who even the South Carolina primary, right? Regardless of who the ultimate winner of the primary was, uh, every single primary, the majority of Democratic voters said they support moving to a single payer healthcare system. But we can't get the party to even have that conversation, right? When we look at the COVID relief bills, we can point a lot of fingers at Mitch McConnell in the Senate, but to be honest, the bill that they're blocking, the HEROES Act, while, it would have been some level of relief 5.5, 6 months ago when it was passed, it's woefully insufficient to deal with the problems that people are facing right now. We're the only industrialized country in the world that hasn't provided guaranteed income to their citizens during this crisis. We're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't guarantee health care to their citizens, not just during this crisis, but before this crisis started, right? And we have done nothing to address the fact that yet again the first has come and gone, and millions of people are racking up debt, right? Racking up past due rent that will come due at the end of the year as the eviction moratorium gets rescinded, and people will have no ability to pay. And so, one thing that Trump said that really, sort of cut a knife through my heart as somebody who spent almost a decade organizing in the Fight for 15 and helping to pass $15 an hour in cities across this country, is that, Trump said that the Democratic Party is the party of the liberal elites, of the coastal elites, of the tech elites, and the Republican Party is the party of the working class. And, to be clear, most working class voters, right, people who make less than $50,000 a year, did actually end up voting for Joe Biden in this election. That's a shift from 2016. The fact that the Republican Party has a sort of front and center ownership of sort of working class issues is incredibly problematic, and it certainly will be problematic for 2022 when we don't have a sort of animating force like Trump on the ticket, and we are, asking our folks to come out and be motivated to vote, and we haven't proposed any policies that will really change the material conditions in their lives.
For my final question, and I think this is an important one because you mentioned, for example, I believe it was Wisconsin or Michigan, about the unregistered voters of color. And that really struck me because there's so much noise, publicity, discussion about voting, and yet
fixation,
whatever you want to call it, about voting and those people of color who are eligible to vote. What do you believe is the reason that they have to be prompted? And if they have now become registered voters, what is it that can be done to make sure that voting remains a priority for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other voters don't need to just be prompted to vote. They need to be protected as they try to participate in our democracy. That's certainly what we learned this year. And as we have, a racist authoritarian who still refuses to accept a peaceful transition of power, right? The reality is that we understood that not only did we need to have record turnout in these communities in order to defeat Donald Trump, but we would need to guard every single one of those votes and protect every single one of those votes in the outcome. And we're doing that, right? The great news is that our plans and our scenario planning on election day and before election day went exactly according to plan. And we have the outcome we have because of the plans and the organizations that were in place to guard those votes in these cities. But now we have to move on to the second piece of the strategy, right? We never imagined that Joe Biden was going to be a perfect, a perfect president for us. We understand that this was about changing our opponent and the material conditions of the struggle and the fight, and having a more favorable opponent. So that's where we're at. We need to turn our attention now to governance, because if we motivate all these people and then 2 years from now, people are in more pain than they are in right now. We haven't dealt with the economic crisis. We're in a Great Depression, and our response to that is austerity, is allowing cities to go bankrupt. All of those people that we motivated to show up in record numbers are going to sit home or not participate because they're going to feel as though there's no reason for them to engage in 2022. And that could be setting us up for someone much worse than Trump to gain and rise to power in 2024. And so we are watching the Democrats, and our message to folks is you need to organize and to be involved as deeply and as powerfully, under a new Biden administration in order to build the country of our dreams, as you have been in this resistance to Donald Trump and his agenda for the last 4 years. You cannot go back to sleep and assume that everything is taken care of now that there's a Democrat in power. Because the reality is for our communities, and now I'm speaking specifically to Black folks, right? For Black people in this country, Democrat or Republican, our people has still struggled. And we will have to fight white supremacy, which existed long before Donald Trump, long after Donald Trump is no longer in the White House.
And of course, the president has said or tossed around the idea that he could run again in 4 years.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, exactly what you're talking about. It's not over just because you think it's over.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to stay ready. What is that old Black woman proverb? Stay ready. You ain't got to get ready.
Get ready.
Yep.
Jennifer Epps Addison, co-executive director of CPD Action. Thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate your time.
Harold, always great to talk to you. Thank you.
That is it for this edition of HUR at Home. I'm Harold Fisher, and as always, I'll see you on the radio.